Hello everyone. So for my November wrap up, I decided to split it into two parts. So this is part 2 where I just talk about the nonfiction books I read. If you want to hear about the fiction books I read in November, I'll link part 1 down below. But I thought I would split them up because I did end up reading quite a lot of nonfiction. How many do I have here? 1, 2, 3. 7 nonfiction books. It was nonfiction November, so I was really making nonfiction books a priority. And it turned out to be really great. I gave all of these nonfiction books either 4 or 5 stars. So I had all of them were really excellent. All of them I learned something from and really engaged with and had a great time reading these. It just reminds me that I need to be sprinkling nonfiction more throughout my year. I do read nonfiction throughout the year, but not as much as I should, because if I gave all of these 4 and 5 star, I should be reading more nonfiction. And obviously nonfiction that I know I'm going to enjoy, things that are kind of targeted at areas that interest me. So I'm going to start off with my 5-star reads, because if you don't make it through this whole video, I really want you to hear about this first book, because it's probably going to be my favorite book of the year, maybe. It's definitely in the top 5 of the year. I absolutely love this book. I thought it was kind of a perfect book in terms of the writing and topic and just everything. I have no complaints about this book or anything that I would change about it. And that book is How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith. And what this book is that Clint Smith decided to kind of go around the country. He starts in his hometown of New Orleans, and then he goes around to different kind of landmarks and areas in the country and talks about how those areas relate to a history of slavery in our country. And he does go one place abroad. So most of it is in the United States and one place in Africa, and he's just visiting each of those sites. He's talking to he's going on the tours. So the tour guide, he talks about what the tour guides say in the general tour, and then he interviews people, both like people that work at the places that he is visiting, and then also tourists and why they came to that site and what are their connections to it and what are their thoughts about the history of the location. And so it's very much told from a journalistic point of view, which is a form of nonfiction I really enjoy. I like nonfiction that is written by journalists because I think that they, or at least the ones I've read, it makes it so interesting. So I think he writes for The Atlantic and The New Yorker and New York Times Magazine. So he writes in a lot of these places that when you write for a publication like that, you need to grab people in right away. And so I like that style of writing. Clint Smith is also a poet. He has a book of poetry out, and you can tell from this. My husband and I listened to this on audiobook as we were driving down for Thanksgiving and back. And we did listen to it in earbuds because it's not appropriate for children to hear, since there is graphic information about the history of slavery and also the Civil War and things like that. So we listened to it on headphones, and he narrates it himself, and you can just tell like the poetry and his like words and his voice. And so I would definitely recommend it on audiobook because I thought he did a great job narrating it. I thought his like descriptions of the people and the places were very vivid and really like pulled me in and made me feel like I was there. And just to give you an example of some of the locations, the first place he visits is Monticello, which was the home of Thomas Jefferson, and kind of talks about how would Thomas Jefferson been able to do all the things he did if he didn't have 100 people that he owned working for him and taking care of his home. So it's just talking about how slavery really, was the basis of a lot of the beginning founding parts of our country, and just us coming to terms with that and recognizing our history. Because I feel like a lot of people are trying, they don't want to talk necessarily in school about all of the hard details about our history. Like obviously we learn about slavery in school, but are we really learning all of like the details of how the country was built and, was how our whole history is affected by slavery? One of the things I really enjoyed about this book is that, like I said, he interviews a lot of people and he really just lets people tell their stories. He doesn't lead them in the conversation when he's asking them. He talks to all sorts of people. Like he's talking to like people from like he went to a rally for I think they're called the Sons of the Confederacy, and so he was the only Black man in that meeting, and he interviews all these people and just doesn't, infer anything. He just asks them questions and lets them talk. And yes, in his writing and as he's going, you see what he feels and all that. It's not like it's unbiased, but he lets people talk and he gathers their information and puts it in this book, and then talks about the history and how he feels and all that. I just thought it was amazing. I would highly recommend it. I think there's a lot to learn, especially if you live in America. I think that this is very important history. And I think it's also important to remember that this wasn't that long ago. I have highlighted this section. There's a section where he is interviewing his grandparents, and his grandparents had family members they knew that were slaves. And so it's not that far in the history. And also his grandparents would have grown up in the Jim Crow South and going through the civil rights movement and all that. So that was a really impactful section where he talks about his grandparents' stories. And after that, he talks about how he's saying how when we think of history of slavery and racism in the country, I think about how quick we are to espouse notions of progress without accounting for its uncertain and serpentine path. And I'm editing this a little bit so I don't read the whole paragraph, and I'm taking out a few words that I can't say on video. But he says, I forget that many of the men and women who spat on the Little Rock Nine are still alive. If you don't know, the Little Rock Nine were a group of 9 students who were going into the schools in Little Rock as the first kids that were integrating into the school, and they were treated horribly. I forget that so many of the people who threw rocks at Dr. King are still voting in our elections. I forget that, but for the arbitrary nature of circumstance, what happened to Emmett Till could have happened to my grandfather. That the children who threw food at my grandmother are likely bouncing their own great-grandchildren on their laps. And he just goes on and on how this isn't ancient history, that the things that happened to his grandparents and his grandparents, parents and grandparents is not that long ago. We're talking less than 200 years. And so when you think about that, we really need to be learning about that history so we don't repeat the way we treat each other in the future. So all that saying, I think it was excellent. This is his first full-on book. He has a poetry book, and then obviously he's written for a lot of publications, but I'll be reading anything that he comes out with in the future that comes out in book form, because I thought this was just excellent. One of my favorite books of the year. Very impactful. Then the other 5-star book I read was They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, and this is a graphic memoir, so it is drawn. George Takei is famous because he was on Star Trek. I actually don't know what character he played because I never watched Star Trek, but Star Trek is huge, and so a lot of people know who George Takei is. And this is his memoir of his time when he was a little boy, how his family was put in a Japanese internment camp in America. So it was right after Pearl Harbor, and there was a lot of Americans that were afraid of what the Japanese living in America would do, and so they put them in internment camps. And this really gives the nitty-gritty of what happened. So some of it is from his memory, and a lot of it sounds like when he was a teenager he interviewed his not interviewed but had a lot of discussions with his dad to give details to kind of fill in the picture of what he remembers of what it was like. So it's not just his memories, but also all the things his dad told him about what it was like living in these camps. And yeah, this is very impactful. I don't remember in school really learning about this part of American history. I know that I remember learning about there being animosity towards Japanese during World War II, but I didn't know all the details of how much hatred there was and how, American citizens were placed in these camps. And not everybody was American citizen, and it talks about that. And it doesn't matter. It still was wrong to be putting all these people in these camps, taken away from their homes. And even when they were released, it's not like they got their homes back. And just hearing all the details. So I think this is really impactful. Since it's a graphic form, it is very fast to read, but it is a heavier topic and told from a child's point of view, so that can be pretty heavy too. I just really enjoyed this and learning more about our history. And it's just really important, I think, for us to learn about the hard parts in history. Yes, it's not fun to learn about those aspects, but I think it's important to learn about the hard things in American history. So those are my 2 5-star reads. I would definitely recommend both of those. And now onto my 4-star reads. All of these were really great as well. I might just not have like been as absorbed in the topic, or maybe didn't like the writing as much, things like that, but they were all satisfying reads, things that I really enjoyed learning about. So the first one, which is probably the most impactful one, is Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. And this one was really impactful because I have definitely changed my lifestyle since reading this book. And when you first read the title, and if you've read the description, you might think that all he's trying to do is turn people vegetarian. But I don't really think that that's what this book is about. I think it's really about informing people about where their food comes from. So basically at the beginning of this book, he talks about how he's been on and off again a vegetarian and didn't really know how he felt about it. But then when he had a son, he decided he really wanted to learn where his food, especially like animal products, came from, to see if he wanted to feed them to his son. And so he starts doing all this stuff. It's very, it's written in the aspect of him, you know, going to visit these farms or talking to people that work at them and things like that. So he's kind of getting firsthand account of what's happening on these farms. And I don't think his goal is necessarily to make everybody vegetarian. Like, yes, I think he believes, and he states this, that he thinks that eating animals is not something that humans need to do. And he gives that argument. But he also shows like small independent farms and how they are treating their animals in an ethical way, and how he doesn't have a problem with people eating meat from those farms. And so if his goal was to get people to stop eating factory farmed meat, then he has accomplished that goal with me. Since I have read this book, I've said, we are no longer buying factory farmed meat, which means meat mostly from the grocery store and restaurants. But it doesn't mean that I'm going vegetarian. Like, for me personally, I don't believe that humans have to be vegetarian. I think that we were kind of created to be omnivores, just like I wouldn't tell animals that they can't eat each other, because it's just part of the life cycle of Earth and nature and things like that. Like, I do believe that, but I don't think that we need to torture our animals in order to be able to eat them. And he really gives the details of what happens to these animals on these big factory farms, and also not just about the treatment of animals. So if you're like, well, I don't care about the treatment of animals, he's also talking about how it affects our health, like the antibiotics and things that they are giving the animals in order so that they're not sick at the farm, and what that does to our bodies, and also about what factory farming and the waste that comes from it affects the environment. So he's not just talking about treatment of animals. But for me, I like physically could not eat the meat from the store after reading that. Like, it just makes me sick. Of course, I am in a privileged position because we live in the country. Turns out that we have a small family-run farm that has, you know, pasture-fed chickens and pigs 5 minutes down the road. So I am lucky that I could just go 5 minutes down the road and order a bunch of ethically raised meat. And then we have like a cow farm 20 minutes away where we could buy a fourth of a cow. So I am in a privileged position. Not everybody can do that. He does give ways to buy from stores that would be more ethically sound. And, you know, sometimes it just takes a little research. It does cost more. And I understand that's also a position of privilege, but also we are not upping our food budget in order to eat ethically raised meat. I've talked to my husband, and we just decided we're not going to be eating meat every day. We might only eat meat. We haven't, you know, we've only started this month. So we only might eat meat 2 to 3 times a week. And the rest of the time we'll be eating only plant-based foods, just because we want to stay in the same budget. So I'm not saying that everybody should do this, because I know that there's budget concerns and there's location concerns and, you know, supply and all that stuff. But I would suggest reading this book. I think that it's important for us to know where our food comes from and just having that information. So I would suggest this book is also like 10 years old. So there probably are other books. So if you don't want to read this one, I'm sure there are other people that have written about the same topic. So I would just suggest learning more about what factory farming is like in America and how that affects not just the animals, but the environment and our future and everything. I'm realizing, as I've only talked about 3 of the 7 books, that this is going to be a long one. I just feel like with nonfiction, there's a lot to talk about. So there's still 4 more books to go. I will always put down in the description the title of the book and where to go to. So if there's ones you want to skip, you can always go to the timestamps down below. So the next one I read was The Woman Who Would Be King, Hatshepsut's Rise to Power in Ancient Egypt by Cooney. And this is a history book about Hatshepsut, who was a pharaoh in ancient Egypt. We were studying ancient Egypt with my daughter in school, and it was something that we were both really fascinated by. We were only supposed to study for 3 weeks, and I think we ended up studying for 5 weeks, and we still go back and read some more books about Egypt. Like, she still requests to watch videos and read books about Egypt, so we kind of are still interspersing that in as we move on in history. But she just loved this topic, and I really did too. I think there's a lot of fascinating things to learn about in ancient Egypt. So I picked up this nonfiction book, and Hatshepsut's just a really interesting character or person. I mean, she's a real person, because at the time in ancient Egypt, men were the rulers. Like, they didn't really pass down to women. So there were very few women rulers that made it to this level as being like pharaoh. And so it's just really fascinating. I will say that Cooney tells us at the beginning in her foreword that she insinuates a lot of things. So not to say she's making it up, she does use archaeological texts and things like that to back up the things she talks about here, but it almost reads like narrative nonfiction, where she puts us in the life of Hatshepsut, what she might be thinking and feeling. And obviously, we don't have all that information. It's not like she kept a journal, so we don't have all of those thoughts and feelings. But I think it made the story so much more interesting than if she had just laid out the bare facts. So just keep that in mind if you're someone that would rather just hear, these are the facts of exactly what happened in the history. That's not what this is. She does have the facts and all that, but she bulks it up by kind of insinuating how it would feel to be a woman that is in a place of power, or that has the ability to be in a place of power. Because how she rises to power is that she starts out as just like the regent for her, now I can't remember if it was her stepson or her nephew. But anyways, like a child king always needs to have a regent that helps him rule until he's old enough to rule on his own. And so just being in that position of where you're basically the ruler, but you don't have the name, and what that would feel like and how you would want to, be in that place of power. And so I really enjoyed that she kind of puts in that information and really makes us feel what Hatshepsut might have been feeling in the moment. But just keep that in mind, that there is some that is bulked up than just the basic facts. But I really enjoyed this, and I read other things by Cooney. I know she's written a couple other books that are about Egyptian history and about the pharaohs, and so I would probably read other ones by her because I thought that was really interesting. Then I read Atomic Habits, An Easy and Proven Way to Build Good Habits and Break Bad Ones by James Clear. And this is kind of like a self-help about, how to change your habits. And this is one of those books that I think, a lot of it is common sense, things you probably already heard before, but it's nice to be reminded and be given like little steps. And I like his approach, how he talks about how you're not going to make a change just by pure willpower. People are like, I want to, start exercising 4 days a week. You're probably not going to get there just by like telling yourself, I'm going to do it today. I'm going to do it today. He's saying that you really have to build yourself up for success. So just taking that, for example, it would be like, instead of just saying that I'm going to do it the next day, that you're actually like getting in the habit of, when you put your pajamas on at night, you set your workout clothes right by your sink or something like that. So you can get up in the morning, you can, splash your face with water, put on your workout clothes and go. So he's talking about how to change your routine and set up these ways to do it easier. Because as human beings, we're going to go for the easy way. We're going to go for the routine. It's just kind of the way, once you're on a path, you just kind of go on that path. It's just how it is to be a human. And yes, you can want to do something, but are you going to actually do it unless you set yourself up for success? And so that's why I like his method. My problem is that I have these ideas of things I want to do, and I'm like, I need to sit down and make a plan because I have to do what he says, and I have to I have to set myself up, and I've got to put it in my routine, but I feel like I have to take the time to like figure out where in my routine to add these things in to they would make sense. And then that just seems like overwhelming, and then I just don't do it. So that's the only problem I have. It has nothing to do with him and the book. It just has to do with me and my like, you know, the rolling ball of like, oh, I gotta like make the system, but I would have to like take time to make the system. So yeah, I do need to like do those things just for the things that I want to change in my life. But in terms of the book, I think it is laying out some easy little steps. Like I said, it's common sense stuff, but it really is a good reminder. I just need to actually implement it, which is always the problem with self-help books, isn't it? All right, and then the next one I read is The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth by Beth, Allison, Barr. And this book turned out to be different than what I thought it was going to be. And at first I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm enjoying this book. But as it went on, I reframed how I looked at this book, and then I feel like I still got a lot out of it. So I think what I need to say is what I thought this book was, and then what it turned out to be, so you could kind of see where the expectations fell off. But then once you reframe, if you know what it is going in, I think it's very valuable. So I knew she was a professor from reading this, that she's a historian and she is a professor, and I thought she'd be going through the history of Christianity and talking about how our history and our background of how things progress through the world has changed the way the Bible is interpreted, and how women's like kind of place in the world, like in the patriarchy and things like that, have been changed from biblical times to now based on our society, is what I thought it was. And it is somewhat. Her focus as a historian is on medieval times and the like Middle Ages, and so she does bring in some of that, what happened during that, the Reformation and medieval times did change the interpretation of the Bible. How when we went through the Reformation and also the Gutenberg press and things like that, how the what are they called? Translations of the Bible that happened at that time did change some of the wording to change how women are viewed in certain areas of Christianity. So she does talk about that, but a lot of this really is more a focus on as almost like a memoir of how she grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and how as she learned more in her like as a historian and as a professor, how she thought that it wasn't right the way the church was keeping women from being leaders. So she has a PhD. She teaches, adult students, because she teaches at a university, and her husband was a teacher of the youth at a Southern Baptist church, and he was sick one day, and she wasn't allowed to take his place unless she asked, because she had to ask permission in order to teach this group of students, because there were both boys and girls, and in this church women are not allowed to teach boys that are older than, I think it was something like 13 years old. So if they're older than 13, women are not allowed to teach them. And she realized that's not right. And it makes sense. You are an adult woman and you're not allowed to teach 13-year-old boys. So as someone who grew up in a denomination of Christianity where we do have women pastors, also our highest leader in our church, like our presiding bishop, is a woman, so I grew up seeing women as religious leaders. This was completely foreign to me, just her experiences in the Southern Baptist Church. And so when I reframe this as more like learning about the more conservative denominations in America, then I feel like I got more out of this book, because I don't feel like it focuses much on the history and how the Bible has been interpreted different. I mean, she does include that. I'm not saying it's not included. I just don't think that's actually like her whole point. She even talks about towards the beginning of this book that she wrote this book specifically for other women or even men, to show that yes, women have value in the church and have a voice, and that you can link that to biblical times and things like that. I don't think I'm making complete sense. I do think this is a good book. I gave it 4 stars. I just think I had to reframe the way I saw it. And the last book I'm going to talk about is What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by Aubrey Gordon. And I actually ended up highlighting, or like it's a library book, so just putting in post-it notes in quite a few places in this book, because I learned a lot reading this book. And basically what it's about is her looking at the way fat people are treated, and in all different aspects. Like she talks about, denied doctor services, how they're treated on airplanes, how jokes about fat people are part of society, and how people look at her from day to day, or anybody that is overweight, and all this stuff. And she talks about a lot of facts and figures in this book. And like one of the ones that amazed me the most when she was talking about, I don't remember, it's been long enough because I read this at the beginning of November, that she talks about how I think like something like, is it something like 60%? Don't quote me on this because I don't remember the percentage, but it's something like 60% of people in America are counted as being overweight, like in terms of what the doctor's scale is. They're, considered overweight. And yet fat people are treated so badly in so many different realms. And she was talking about how there are in the United States, that almost all of the states, except for I think it was like 2 or 3. And like I said, don't quote me on these stats because it's been a month since I read this, but that like it was something like 2 or 3 states are the only ones that protect the rights of fat people in terms of like hiring, firing. Like somebody could fire you because they say that you're fat and lazy, and that you have no actual like legal way to counteract that. And I just thought that was like, whoa, like I can't believe that like so many people in the country are considered overweight, and yet there is not legal protection for people in terms of like human resources and things like that. And like the airlines can just decide to cancel your ticket if you are overweight, and they don't think that there is space in the plane and things like that. Like just stuff like that I was like, how is that even possible that there's no recourse for people? So I think this is really informative of just like what the experience is like to be an overweight person. And she is not just talking like, I know there were scales. She split them up into like categories of like small fat, which would be like 1x to 2x, mid fat, super fat, and then fat, which is like 6x plus. And I think she's in the super fat category, at least at the time of writing this. And so what it's like to be in that category, not just like being a little, like in terms of the BMI index, not just being like a little bit overweight, but what would fit into this category of super fat. And I just think it's really important to learn about different perspectives. I did read something recently. I'm in like a homeschool Facebook group, and somebody posted a topic recently where they were talking about diversity in kids books, and how kids books are like, as time goes on, publishing is getting better about putting people of different skin colors and different religions and things like that in these picture books. But this woman who is a sensitivity reader, she said one thing that hasn't been changed is that there's not a lot of fat people in children's books. And so I do think it's important to read about all kinds of diversity. So not just in, what the experience is like for a different skin color or a different religion, but also what it's like to be a fat person in a world and in a society that treats you the way she is treated. And she's not just talking about herself, like, yes, this is kind of memoir-like, and that she's talking about her experience. Like, it kind of goes back and forth. She'll start the chapter with like an experience that happened to her, but then she will put in a lot of facts and data and research showing how this is like a universal thing about how people are treated. And so I thought this was really interesting. It's very short too. Like this even has notes and stuff. So I think in total it was only like 160 pages. And I listened to this on audiobook as well, and then went back through and like highlighted sections that I wanted to think about. So very quick read. And I think it's important if you're looking at reading about more diversely about other people's experience, or maybe your own experience or whatever. I think this is an important book to learn more about both personal experience and the data that's out there about what's actually going on. And those are the nonfiction books that I read in November. Like I said, I enjoyed all of them. And, you know, some of them maybe not enjoyed is the right word because there were some hard things in it, but I enjoy the process of learning about something I don't already know a lot of detail about. So I did enjoy the like learning process in all of those books and would recommend any of them. So depending on if they are topics that you are interested in, but especially I would say if you're going to pick one book to read in this, read How the Word is Passed because it's so excellent. Audiobook was really good. So that's it for me. If there were books you read in Nonfiction November that you would like to share that you think I might be interested in, as you can tell, I have kind of a wide range of interest. Put them down below so I can add them to my read list in the future. And I definitely should be reading more nonfiction with how much I loved all of these books. And that's it for me. I'll see you next time. Bye.